Coindre Hall Park Community is a non-profit community group and sponsor of tonight's event. And now, I would like to introduce to you the president of Coindre Hall Park Community, Desiree Ben Galgano. Let's hear it for her.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to an evening of education and enlightenment. This evening is about ecology and the environment. Across Long Island, open spaces are routinely being developed. Thoughtful development means sustainable development. For almost 2 years, we had advocated for thoughtfulness. In doing so, we have had pushback from those who have had a different vision for the park. Our message is that Coindre Hall wetlands and the natural habitats that support them are extremely valuable assets to our community, and we should do whatever we can to preserve them. Coindre Hall is the most ecologically significant park that is publicly accessible on Huntington Harbour and is free for all to enjoy. My journey began in the summer of 2021, while on a walk I heard chainsaws in the park and I came upon a tree crew busy at work clear-cutting an acre of wetlands and woodlands. Quite understandably, I and my public immediately began to ask questions. How did this happen? Why did this happen? These are a small sample of 100 trees that were cut down, leaving only the occasional stump and wood chips blanketing the ground. In this case, this was done preemptively for a parking lot. This slide shows the plan for the parking lot, which can be found on the advisory board website now. In search of answers, we immediately began to attend the Coindre Hall Advisory Board meetings. This board was created by Suffolk County Legislature to advise on changes in the park. Minutes clearly indicate suggestions for the park were not in keeping with its character or ecological integrity. On the screens are direct quotes from the Coindre Hall Advisory Board minutes. Entries in the July 2021 minutes read as follows. Bring developers in so that there are experts creating a plan or design that the committee can choose from. Gave the example of golf course architects. Suggested a concession agreement for a concessionaire to create a marina-like activity with tennis, a pool to be considered. The Vanderbilt was discussed, and discussion of using a shuttle bus to the boathouse, similar to how the Vanderbilt does it, could be considered. And in the minutes of June 2021, he suggested that it could be a 5-star waterfront park. Marina, shuttle bus, developers. These quotes are direct quotes taken from the Coindre Hall Advisory Board minutes and can be found on the Coindre Hall Advisory Board website now. There are so many such examples as these. Small wonder the community became concerned. The information we share with the public can be substantiated. For the record, we have never suggested that condos or casinos were planned at Coindre Hall Park. That's ridiculous. After discovering what was being discussed at the Coindre Hall Advisory Board meetings, we felt the need to step in and protect the ecological integrity of the park, and that is what we did. We spoke at every Suffolk County meeting, and community advocacy has moved the needle. Our work has resulted in the New York DEC more than doubling the size of the regulated wetlands in the park, and that's a big deal. Furthermore, Suffolk County has said that they will not cut down any more trees. That's great. That's great. We have met with Suffolk County officials on site, and together we have agreed upon an invasive plant removal plan for the park, and we look forward to continuing to work together with Suffolk County Parks Department. Native plants, fields pulsating with monarch butterflies, and birding trails is what we envision for Coindre Hall's future. Now to tell us why Coindre Hall wetlands are a special place is ecologist David Jakim. David Jakim holds an MS in environmental geoscience and an MA in earth science. education from Queen's College. He has been trained by the Hudsonian Limited to conduct biodiversity assessments for land use planners. He's the founder of Rewild Long Island and the founder of Metropolitan Monarch Butterfly Alliance. For the last decade, Jakeem has been mapping and giving presentations on the flora and fauna and habitats of Long Island, focused on protecting special places. In the fall of 2022, Jakeem undertook a study of Coindre Hall Park and the Coindre Hall Park community, with the Coindre Hall Park community, to bring this presentation to you today.
Thank you so much, Desiree. It is such an honor to speak before you and the Coindre Hall Park community this evening, and to share my ecological research and findings over the course of this last year. So I'd like to speak to the Coindre Hall Park wetlands and ecology, and why this place should be protected. As an introduction, I would like to share some information about the history of this place, and why it is valuable as a historic site as it is valuable as an environmental site. Coindre Hall Park is a 33-acre Gold Coast estate. West Neck Farm, also known as Coindre Hall Park, is on the National Register of Historic Places and protected under the Suffolk County Historic Trust. The view overlooking Huntington Harbor that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen and Puppy Cove to the left includes the Lloyd Neck Lighthouse of 1857. I would like to move in now to also examine some of the habitats around the site. On the right-hand side of the introductory slide here, you can see Butterfly Pond, which is a pond that was first established to collect ice during the winter, and now is one of the most breathtaking habitats at Coindre Hall Park, along with its own fantastic species and ecology. So to take a look at Coindre Hall Park and the local geography, Coindre Hall Park is significant because it is located next to a number of other environmental preserves or protected areas, as well as to Huntington Harbor. The wildlife species butterflies that occupy and live in Coindre Hall Park also visit and grace all the other places around Huntington and our region. Protecting extensive habitat areas and relatively small habitat areas provides habitat value for these species that otherwise and that are becoming more commonly threatened, endangered, and imperiled. To take a closer look and an overview look at Coindre Hall Park, I've devised a habitat map with assistance from Desiree. And this habitat map includes a number of different features. You can see the lime green area. That's a lawn or a cultural space, and that runs straight through the park from north to south. The green area surrounding that lawn area is upland forest, which is the largest, the most predominant habitat type on the Coindre Hall Park. And then to the northern side, to the northern portion of Coindre Hall Park, are 4 acres of wetlands that are of particularly special interest. So wetlands are habitats that are flooded or saturated soils that support specially adapted species and communities. Of the wetland habitats that we have at Coindre Hall Park includes a wet meadow habitat, which is a regionally rare habitat on Long Island and in Huntington. And because this habitat is rare, it should be continue to be managed for the associated rare wildlife that it supports. There's a freshwater marsh, which is a more deeply flooded wetland that has emergent vegetation. There's a small hardwood swamp, half an acre, and we'll see more about that. And then there is the Butterfly Pond, which is less than half an acre. Of special interest are springs and seeps that feed and interconnect the habitats from the uplands of Coindre Hall Park through the wetlands and into Huntington Harbor. There are springs and seeps that emerge from the ground and flow into the different wetlands, the wet meadow, the swamp, the marsh, and ultimately under the ground into Huntington Harbor. And the quality of these wetlands is critical to the water quality, the life that lives in them, as well as the water quality of Huntington Harbor and the life that lives there as well. Not to mention, adjacent is the Gold Star Beach Park, and we'll take a look at that. I'd also like to briefly mention that another important resource or another important thing about wetlands is that they provide flood and stormwater control. So after storms, this allows the water to percolate into the ground without ponding and disturbing built areas and habitats. In addition, the water that cycles through these wetlands recharges our groundwater system and cleans it in that process of nitrogen and other toxic pollutants that are flowing into Coindre Hall Park from underground from across Huntington. I mentioned these springs and seeps that feed the wetlands, and here are a few images of those. On the left-hand side, you can see an intermittent woodland stream that flows after rainfall events into the wetland. In the middle of the slide, you can see a pussy willow in standing water. Pussy willows are a specially adapted species to wetland environments. In the lower middle, you can see a seep. This is an area where, a lawn area where groundwater is emerging to the surface. And on the right-hand side, you can see another seep and spring that's feeding the marsh system. These springs are critically important as to their interconnectivity with the habitats at Coindre Hall Park and the interconnectivity into Huntington Harbor. The entire wetland is part of a system from the uplands of Coindre Hall Park, Huntington, and ultimately into Huntington Harbor. Gold Star Beach is an example of where groundwater emerges to the surface as it passes through the Gold Star Beach Park in this case. There is similar discharge into Huntington Harbor as the water passes through Coindre Hall Park. Here you can see on the left-hand side a stream, intermittent, that flows in the intertidal zone, and this stream feeds Huntington Harbor. Another important habitat area in our region is freshwater marsh. As I mentioned, freshwater marshes are habitats that support vegetation, non-woody vegetation, that are deeply flooded during the year. On the left-hand side, you can see this freshwater marsh that is and upland meadow that includes this beautiful goldenrod on the left-hand side. This is seaside goldenrod associated with beach-like habitats close to the sea. In the background, behind the goldenrod, you can see common reed or Phragmites that is a typical species of freshwater marshes, and indicative that this freshwater marsh is indeed fresh and not salty throughout most of the year. Although, as we will see, there is coastal flooding that enters into this marsh and alters and impacts the habitat area. On the right-hand side, you can see some other images of freshwater marshes, more Phragmites that's deeply flooded on the upper middle, pussy willow on the upper right. There's a blue dasher dragonfly perched on a Phragmites leaf in the lower middle. And on the lower right-hand side, you see a monarch butterfly that is perched on a Joe pieweed plant, collecting nectar for its journey from Mexico to as far as Canada every year. The wet meadow is especially interesting because of the butterflies and birds that it supports. This includes, again, the monarch butterfly, the ruby-throated hummingbird. On the right-hand side, you can see a sulfur butterfly perched on a plant called blue vervain. And we have a swallowtail butterfly on the left-hand side. All this fauna occupies this very rich wet meadow, a wet meadow that supports a tremendous diversity of plants, as well as associated wildlife. Butterfly Pond, so named because of the profusion of butterflies that occupy this habitat area, is also so called because it supports swamp milkweed. This is a plant that's gotten a bad rap, swamp milkweed, but as you can see, it has these beautiful pink flowers. It's a plant that's being planted all around Long Island now to support monarch butterflies, all around the East Coast. I'd like to speak for a minute about the monarch butterfly. They are a critically imperiled species and a candidate for the federal endangered species list. The monarch butterfly, as I mentioned, travels from Canada to Mexico each year, taking 4 generations to travel from Mexico to Canada, and then a single generation to go back to Mexico, where it overwinters in the mountains. Due to habitat loss, climate change, and direct harms to habitats, the monarch butterfly may not be on Earth in the coming decades. But planting swamp milkweed, protecting swamp milkweed in Coindre Hall Park and in other places secures their sole host plant. Swamp milkweed and milkweeds in general are the only plants that the monarch butterfly can support, or the only plant that the monarch butterfly caterpillar eats as it becomes a chrysalis and then an adult. Butterfly Pond is also very interesting. There's an artesian spring. It's a spring where there's a lot of pressure, a lot of water underground that's being thrust up to the surface with a lot of force, and it feeds the butterfly pond along with its wildlife. One species of wildlife that is supported in that pond is the Fowler's toad, Bufo fowleri, and you can identify it. It's got each little black wart spot on the back of its, on the back has 2 little warts inside of it. On the left-hand side, you can see a great blue heron. On the right-hand side, a green heron. So these are crooked-necked birds that are fishers, and they will stand in a pond on one leg silently for hours, waiting for a fish or an unlucky toad to swim by, and pierce that animal with its harpoon-like beak. And this particular species is especially vulnerable to human disturbance. We have muskrat, which is actually another beautiful species that has gotten a bad rap. It's very similar to a beaver, but more diminutive. And on the right-hand side, we have a great egret, both occupants of Butterfly Pond. We have freshwater marshes with pussy willow on the left-hand side, which, by the way, is celebrated in Russian Orthodox culture for Palm Sunday. It's one of the few flowers that comes out around Palm Sunday, and it's gathered for that celebration. And on the right-hand side, again, you can see more swamp milkweed. I'd like to pay attention for a minute to the different type of flora that occupy the different habitats. We have monkey flower, going from left to right, sensitive fern, more sensitive fern, and also sallow sedge. The wet meadow is remarkable because it supports a great diversity of sedges and rushes that are uncommon in our area, and that reflects the quality of that meadow and the habitability of that meadow for some of the wildlife that we've been talking about. Here are more images of that wet meadow, and you can see the great diversity of flowers represented by the diversity of colors. And in the spring, we have our early flowering woodland or early flowering wet meadow species, followed by goldenrod and Joe Pye we did in the summer, and then asters in the fall. There's always something blooming there. There's always pollen for species to take up. The hardwood swamp, which is a small swamp, less than half acre in extent, is actually composed of a number of species that are regionally rare. Perhaps the only occurrence of this assemblage of species in Suffolk County, based upon the Ecological Communities of New York State, a publication by the DEC. This hardwood swamp includes tupelo, red maple, sweet gum, dogwood, again, species that form a community that is rare in our region. Here's just some more pictures of the hardwood swamp that is seasonally flooded. The hardwood swamp, as you can see also on the left-hand side, supports owls, perhaps great horned owls that dismember their prey. And another nice shot of the forest where these great horned owls occupy. There are specimen trees throughout the forest that grow many feet in diameter, sweet gum and red maple. And these are especially important trees, not only for wildlife, but also for our culture and for the aesthetic value of the park. The upland forests are of particular interest. There are different types of forests throughout the site. On the southern portion of the site, adjacent to development, is an area predominated by Norway maple. There are other larger portions of the site that include a number of native species, native maples, oaks, hickories, sassafras, and here in this picture you can see spice bush on the right-hand side. A diverse forest ground cover. So a lot of the species on the ground are regionally uncommon. This forest supports fall flowering asters, for which there should be more surveys done during the year, because there are a number of rare species that have not been identified that likely occur at the park. There's Christmas fern, which is green throughout the year, and on the right-hand side is May apple, which is a food, the fruits of which are eaten by many animals. The forests also support a diverse assemblage of fungi, and here on the lower right-hand side you can see chicken of the woods, so called because it tastes like chicken, and on the lower left-hand side you can see some oyster mushrooms. Now, the connection between forests and their mushrooms is extremely interesting, and in recent years and in recent decades we've come to a great new amount of knowledge and understanding about how forests work and how fungi are symbionts with our local woodlands and trees. In fact, the fungi have what are called mycorrhizal fungus that extends along the tree's root system. This fungus is the primary mechanism for the uptake of water and nutrients from the soil. Also, these fungi between the trees in the forest intertwine, and they actually connect the forest trees together, whereas older, more mature mother oaks, for instance, will transfer carbohydrates to their daughter and son plants. The trees also send signals to each other, information to each other under the ground about disturbance in the forest area. And they are an important part of the forest's natural immune system. These specimen trees, the old trees that occupy this forest, are especially important because they are they support this fungus under the ground that takes decades to develop and decades to interconnect all the trees. Some more specimen trees here. Oaks and sweet gum. The site supports glacial erratics. These are just gigantic boulders that were tossed aside from the last ice sheet that receded from Long Island about 15 or 12,000 years ago, making the site exceedingly interesting for geology and education. Also, the site potentially supports a number of rare, even potentially threatened and endangered species that ought to be considered and need future further study to evaluate how our actions with the park, how potential developments or other harms and risks might affect this species that potentially occurs at the park. Threats to this species include the cutting of trees, summer roosting habitat, alone or in colonies, and the bats actually, they move, during the summer months, warm months, move underneath of the bark of these trees or crevices. These are trees that are typically large in diameter, and Coindre Hall Park is a suitable habitat for this species. There are a number of ongoing harms and risks, and these include habitat loss, as Desiree was speaking of, habitat fragmentation, the establishment of roads or trails or social trails that disconnect larger contiguous habitats and limit the spread of species from one habitat to another, thereby causing harm to biodiversity, wildlife, and the overall quality of the habitats and wetlands. We also have pollution, so that this includes recycled concrete aggregate, which actually is one of the materials, appears to be gravel, that's what it looks like, that lines some of the roads, and it itself is a source of pollution into butterfly pond and other wetland habitats. In particular, this substrate has a very high pH, which in turn impacts the local wildlife species. Altered hydrology is a very important part of the site. The hydrology and how it interconnects the species. We will look at that briefly more. There are invasive species, and the Coindre Hall Park community has done extensive efforts to remove these species from the wet meadow and other habitats. These most important species of concern include porcelainberry, mugwort, multiflora rose, English ivy, Japanese honeysuckle, all species that are problem areas throughout Long Island and New York State, and all species that are very challenging to remove and require a lot of effort and people power. And the removal of these species is critical to the long-term health of our wet meadow and these habitats. There are deer that browse the different saplings and other plants that do cause direct harm to species, specific species that are browsed in the park. There's a lack of stewardship. There's a tremendous amount of people power needed to help support the site and its ecology in many different ways. And the Coindre Hall Park community is sharing that information, how we can protect the park. And there's also over-exploitation of the habitats, and there's illegal activity that's not being enforced. This includes man-made debris, so this is an instance of pollution in the park, in the wetland system, and that's degrading the quality and also the aesthetics of the wetland itself. There's habitat loss. These are pictures over time, looking back from 2020 to 2021. You can see the amount of vegetation removed on the upper left-hand side, edge of the marsh in July 2020. On the upper right-hand side, you can see that same place with vegetation cleared. Interestingly, the trees that were clear-cut are generating copuses. These are tons of little shoots that are sticking out of the stumps of the trees and are an indicator for the potential future of that habitat area as these copuses, as these saplings mature. Altered hydrology is another major concern for the wetlands. Here you can see different types of impacts that change the way water flows, and this changing of the way that water flows carries pollution, it fragments the different habitats, and also it changes the topography and increases erosion. And here you can see evidence of all these different types of altered hydrology, from building of roads, which is a major concern now and in the future, tire tracks that are in the middle left-hand side of this picture are going through a mucky wetland area. And then there's also drainage from Browns Road and other places that drain into the park. I'd like to mention coastal flooding to roads and habitats by the boathouse. So this site in particular, by the water, is irregularly flooded during extreme storm events. And this wetland habitats support the recharge of this water back into the ground. Without these wetland habitats, this ponding of the site by the boathouse will remain for longer periods of time, and also unmitigated pollution, whereby the wetland plants don't have the, there are no wetland plants to help remediate the area by the boathouse. Before speaking about upcoming events, I want to present a case for why this place should be protected. So, according to the Suffolk County Nature Preserve Handbook, this area meets the multiple criteria to be designated as a nature preserve. The designation of the lower 5 acres, the wetland area of the property, is the only pathway to ensure the protection of this area. We have a number of upcoming events, and thank you. And I would like to now introduce Ed Wong to the stage. He's a professional engineer, an environmental consultant, and member of the Coindre Hall Park community. Thank you.
Good evening. All right, I'm Ed Wong. I'm a professional engineer in New York. I'm an environmental consultant. That's not why I was brought on board, but that's what I am, and I'm part of this group. I've been in Suffolk County for 55 years, so I qualify as somebody that should have a say in what goes on here with Suffolk County. I've been in Huntington for about 35 years. I regularly go to Coindre Hall, and am interested in protecting it. I'm brought up to discuss the environmental regulations, and if that doesn't grab you, I want to deem this the scary part of the presentation, okay? Now I got your attention. The environmental regulations, if you go all the way back, it was man or person versus nature, and I took a course called environmental history, but we fought against nature. So we fought against it for so long that eventually we won. But then we realized that we had done so much damage, and usually, retroactively, we had to develop laws to try to prevent some of this damage in the future. So some of these regulations included the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Comprehensive Environmental Response or CERCLA Act. That's establishes like Superfund sites, Endangered Species Act, Marine Protection, National Environmental Policy, which I will talk about in a little more detail when I get further into the slides. That is all about development and what kind of actions you have to take when you're doing development. Resource conservation, that has to do with hazardous waste and disposals of that nature. But I'm going to focus a little bit on the wetlands as part of the initial discussion of regulations, because that's the one that seems to pertain the most. So those are some of our wetlands. As they discussed already, we had one series of wetlands around the pond, and then thanks to our astute leader over here, she brought in some people, and they realized under a new law that passed last March even, that they could easily add, without having to go through like a 3-year mapping process, secondary wetland area. Now, they didn't do a field delineation on this, so we think it's a little small, and it could be enlarged, so we're interested in that. And then we talked about the benefits of the wetlands, and people don't realize that that kind of area supports so many other ecosystems in and around them that they actually have a designated 100-foot buffer zone around each wetland, but the enforcement of any protections in those areas are really developed by the local jurisdictions. They give laws that they say you can enact to help prevent damage to the actual wetlands themselves. These are specific wetland regulations, and I'm showing you a lot of regulations, and you're supposed to feel warm and fuzzy about, wow, maybe we have some automatic protections involved in all this. And the scary part that I'm bringing up is that these protections do not provide us with much protection at all. Basically because the wetlands, they cannot build on those if they develop plans, but they've already built in the buffer zone, and that got approval already. And you mentioned the RCA, which is recycled concrete material. I've been on environmental sites where that RCA, when water leaches through it, it turns the water from a pH of 7, which is like your normal drinking water, up to a pH of like 12, which is like something you would clean your drains with almost. And I've had to put in systems to treat that water before it can even be discharged. That's right underneath the road in the buffer zone that drains up gradient, down gradient to the wetlands. So that obviously wasn't reviewed very well. They shouldn't have let them use RCA. Okay, this is the secret part that I was mentioning. So any of the development they've done so far can be done like piecemeal and not be subject to what they call the secret review, which would require an environmental impact statement. And if you have to do an environmental impact statement, you have to extensively look at noise and dust and wastewater and habitats, endangered species, all those laws we saw before, but they don't have to do any of that, okay? They've been given basically what they call a negative declaration. So all those laws pertain to some aspect of that review, and they don't have to do it so far. So basically, because of that piecemeal review, the park is vulnerable despite all these regulations. Their basis for the development is the historic use of the site, which was fully developed, but they haven't looked at, and we've seen this from the advisory board, I have never heard them discuss or seen in the minutes any discussion of environmental stuff at all. All right, it's all about development, boathouse and docks and roads and parking lots and things of that nature. They did appoint an environmental person in response basically to all our concerns. So they didn't have to let one of our members on it, of course, because we'd be nothing but trouble. But I haven't heard anything from the environmental guy on that board. Have we heard anything as far as input from him providing any kind of environmental concerns, or maybe their future development will take into account now that we have a larger voice, and hopefully you guys can get involved. Okay, so that's the blue area is the new wetland. So we have at least expanded that protection. So the scary part that I mentioned earlier is that despite all those regulations, all those beautiful pictures you saw before of the park, none of these regulations protect any of that, right? So this is going to be upon us to be involved, to be oversights, and to get, we would like to strive to designate Coindre again as a nature preserve, which provides, a much greater protection of the park and a proactive approach versus a reactive approach. When they throw some stuff in a wetland, they have to it has to be found it has to be reported, it has to be inspected, it has to be evaluated. They have to, as they say in the construction industry, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, which means that, they do what they want to do, and it's hard to catch up, to the environmental regulations that would just be protection of the wetlands, especially since they're fairly small, and the buffer zone is more of a free-for-all, and they've gotten a wetland permit, which allows them to do certain things, which maybe they even shouldn't be able to do in that buffer zone. So anyway, we ask you all to become part of the Coindre Hall community group. Even if you don't agree with every aspect of what we're trying to do, we'd like your input, and we'd like to get involved, because you guys are the only ones that are really going to have a say in how this park ends up, okay? Thank you. Oh, I forgot my quote. So that you can have the trail, or we can have the road, and my quote: a man or person is enriched in proportion to the number of things he can afford to leave alone, okay? So let's be rich in leaving stuff alone. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ed Wong. That was an amazing presentation, and thank you, everybody. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to hand up? What's the question?
This one here.
And if you don't have a card to write a question, we'll give you a card. You can ask a question. Any question? Barbara, what did you want to say?
I wanted to ask whether the DEC is done, or can we further lean on them to do more? Because they were very helpful.
Well, they've gotten a permit to put piles in to save the boathouse, which we're for, because that's part of the historic mandate of the facility. That's 100 feet outside of the current wetlands. They don't have a comprehensive plan. They told me personally they didn't want to pave, but you know that if they put in a dock and a parking lot, and then they have to make it handicap accessible, et cetera, they're going to have to do some paving. Well, like one thing leads to another. This is that piecemeal thing. But so far, they only have the permit for the boathouse, saving the boathouse and the dock. So we'll be watching closely what comes down the pike next.
Because what I wanted to know was, they have done nothing in terms of protecting the environment. They're saving the boathouse and they want the pier. But what about further protection and expansion of the wetlands area? Is that a done deal, or can we still try to about that?
Well, no, that's okay. We don't know what their plan is. So there's. Yeah, I know. We want to know the plan, and they won't tell. No, they won't tell. They just keep doing things. We FOIA the information just to find out what they put in to get a permit for. That's when we find out about it, usually.
The tail wagging the dog.
Yeah, well, but there's a win-win situation somewhere in there. But right now we have to just keep track of what they're doing and try to intervene when possible.
So, we doubled the size of the wetlands. So now what we're going to do is we still feel that there needs to be an on-site delineation, because that doubling, the maps are 1 to 24,000 scale, and for ULI wetlands, that's not accurate according to the DEC's own memorandums. So according to their own memorandums, they are required to, can do an on-site delineation in these instances. So we're going to be keeping an eye out, or we may do our own on-site delineation.
Next question is anyone against the nature preserve designation?
Okay, is anyone against the nature preserve designation? That's a question. I have spoken to advisory board members, and one member has said that he is against the nature preserve designation. I think you're going to have to attend the advisory board meetings and find out why he feels that way. He's against the nature preserve designation. Are dogs allowed in a nature park? Yes, dogs are allowed in nature preserves. Dogs are allowed on leash in a nature preserve. Is a dog park such as now exists at Coindre Hall at odds with the stewardship here? For example, does waste washing downhill into wetlands? Well, currently, all animal wastes are a threat. A farm, geese, and the waste from our toilets. So currently, the primary issue isn't dog waste, though we should strive to keep this, it's not at odds with the stewardship, but if we could have a nature preserve designation, we can have a plan, we can clean up the park correctly. We've advocated recently at the Environmental Parks and Agriculture Committee meeting for them to install a nitrogen reducing septic system for their catering hall and such things. Is the Phragmites in the park native or invasive? Phragmites are invasive, however, they are indicative of wetlands, freshwater wetlands, as Mr. Jakim has expressed. Are there any plans to remove Norway maples and other invasive tree species? Yes, we have met with Suffolk County on site. We presented them with an invasive species removal plan. We prioritized the areas with regards to ecological value and significance, and they agreed upon it. We're just waiting for them to actually just sign the permit, and so we can go ahead. And with everything with the government, it takes a little time. And if anyone wants to volunteer, learn more about native plants, and by removing invasive plants, there's a sign-up sheet outside. Why does Coindre Hall need to be a nature preserve? Well, currently, the park's designation is a historic site. It is, if you go onto Suffolk County website, it's not under park, it is under nature, it's under a historic site. It's listed as having a museum. There is no museum at this park, and the designation of a historic site doesn't really speak to what's there. Why does it need to be a nature preserve? Currently, even though it's protected, there's enforcement. If somebody is found to do something in the wetlands, there is no governance, there's no stewardship, there's no plan. It's for perpetuity, this area isn't protected. If it's degraded because the adjacent areas, they've decided to put a road through it, and it degrades the area, shrinking the area. If the RCA Drano, pH of 12, runs into the wetlands, it gets degraded, you're losing that area, and the area has no other designation currently other than a historic site. And it can have more than one designation. What precise steps can we, the public, take to support your quest for a nature preserve designation? Everyone has a brochure, and on that brochure, there is a QR code. Use your phone, scan the QR code, and it will take you to a change.org petition. Please sign this petition and share the petition with your 100 closest friends. That's exactly the same one. You could also join us and speak at Suffolk County on Tuesday at Suffolk County. I believe it's going to be in Riverhead, and speak up and say, listen, this is something that we would like. We're not against history or the preservation of the boathouse, but we would like to see this, the character of Suffolk County retained. We can't fight development. It's happening, it's coming. But in this, once things get developed and built up so quickly, a road goes in, a parking lot gets slapped down. When you've lost something that's so specifically and uniquely Suffolk County, it's gone forever. We're also on Facebook, Coindre Hall Park Community, and you can email me. Please elaborate on the following topics and plans. 1, boathouse and dock, historical buildings. Yes, the boathouse and dock are historical buildings. The boathouse is protected under the National Register of Historic Places and the Suffolk County Historic Trust. The dock is protected under the Suffolk County Historic Trust. Harbour Police and crew in boathouse. At a recent Suffolk County meeting, which was yesterday, they didn't speak about having the Harbour Police, but they did speak about having a crew, a rowing crew, in the boathouse. The removal of RCA. If we advocate together, I believe that we can get the RCA removed. It doesn't mean there can't be a gravel there. Why would anyone object to making Coindre Hall a nature preserve? Why indeed? Why indeed? If you can still restore the boathouse and you can have your dock, why would you object to making the lower 5 acres a nature preserve? There are wetlands. We've learned so much about the lower 5 acres. What is the resistance? What a nature preserve would do, it would control how ambitious the plans are in the lower 5 acres of that property. If you want it to have a restored boathouse and a restored whatever you want, but a restrained project, the nature preserve is the way to go. But if you don't have that designation, then you know, it's like throwing the dice. What are the vulnerabilities with regards to the future potential development? Well, I think this means, well, David, would you like to answer this? So what are the vulnerabilities with regards to the future potential development?
Well, so there are a number of potentially developable habitats on the site, and also roads on the site that could be established. In particular, habitats adjacent to the boathouse. Infrastructure could be created there to support more traffic, and even potentially boat traffic. In addition, roads extending to the boathouse could cause harm or would cause harm to existing habitats.
Since many of us have visited this park and live nearby, is it possible to get the presentation sent to our email addresses for reference? Yes, of course. Please contact any of us and we will be happy to send this presentation. We'll also have it on our Facebook, but for many of us who hate Facebook, please contact me and I will make sure you have this. Upland meadow or upland forest. What do the terms upland mean? Aren't we at sea level, right?
So an upland is a habitat type that is dry throughout most of the year, where the soil is not saturated and there's no ponding for most of the year. And also, in particular, it supports an assemblage of species that are associated with upland habitats. Only the lower portions of the site have the topography that allows for the springs and seeps to flow into those habitats and create those wetlands.
Would one of the professionals please explain and expand on the DEC definition of wetland, specifically recognition of, and from, when does that recognition start? To my understanding, the DEC website, an explanation by former Regional Director Bragg, !RR flag, that basically once wetlands are established, it trumps any previous use. just read it. Okay, think about that question. You're a professional. I don't really understand. Since the county park, Suffolk has already proceeded with so many modifications and funds, bird, can somebody read that? Sorry? Yes. Urged to continue the development to the lower wetland area without consideration to damage the environmental impact. How can they be stopped now? They are funded through 2024 to 2025 with plans. Well, can you?
Yes, so I think to speak to that question, the 5-acre wetland habitat merits protection and against development and other harms and risks caused by humans. And a habitat area that is greater than 12.4 acres in extent merits protection under the Department of Environmental Conservation, including a 100-foot buffer around that wetland. In addition, the wetlands on the site, it's advisable to create a 100-foot buffer around those wetlands to help support their quality and wildlife value.
So I think one of the questions in that question was, how can they be stopped now? They are funded through 2024 and 2025. I found that, speaking and advocacy really does move the needle, and we have been moving the needle. So I think just consideration for the environment and within their plans to make sure that they include the impacts of what they're doing on the environment I don't know if it's going to stop them, but I think it's certainly going to make them be thoughtful when they do their development. The designation of the lower 5 acres as a nature preserve would be a big step towards that. How about getting the community involved? BioBlitz, Cold Spring Harbor Lab, sequencing of bioplants, endangered species. That's a great idea. Since the county parks at Suffolk have already proceeded with, I think we answered that, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, we did this. Okay. So those are all the questions.
This is just a thought, but Puppy Cove is right next door. It's literally adjacent. And that whole area back there is a pristine, beautiful wetlands area. And there are a lot of species in there that are going to get scared away by the potential development that's being planned for this place. Is there any way that we can get the residents who border Puppy Cove involved to extend the reach of this group so that we're not just in this alone? They stand to really be harmed by this very special little area that's going to disappear. I kayaked there this summer, and all I could think of was these gorgeous herons are not going to be here if they get their way. So has any attempt been made to reach out to those residents?
At this beginning of this process, there was so little information. We can only glean information from the minutes. And those minutes are by the advisory board, and it doesn't mean that, and the advisory board are an advisory body only. They don't make laws. We don't know what's going to be adopted by Suffolk County. So now that we've moved along in this process and we know a little bit more about what's going on as funding's coming through, as they're asking for things, I think that it's a good idea for as many people who are going to be affected to have a seat at the table.
There seems to be a great silence about it in the surrounding area.
I think that whoever lives in the area and wants to reach out to their neighbors, I mean, it would behoove them to ignore what's going on there or not to be involved. So, I mean, that's a great question. How we reach people, how we give messages to people without being accused of manufacturing alarmist stories is challenging.
I wouldn't call it alarmist, I would say it's caretaking. Protection.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, right. So anybody who wants to join in and...
But I can't reach the neighbors in Puffy Cove. They're out of my reach. Out of my pocketbook reach, too. So I don't know what the answer to that is.
We answered this.
We need to expand our
Yep.
I'd like to ask a question. The woman that just spoke about Puppy Cove, I mean, I've lived here 44 years, so anyone who's lived here that long knows the history. And like John Man, I appreciate your question because I think maybe the task here is just coming about as an environmental impact for just a small wetland area, too small. But the reality is Puppy Cove and Huntington Harbor, they were dumping raw sewage in Huntington Harbor years back. People, and some of the people in this room remember that, and the runoffs and things. So if there's truly an environmental impact, and to create a national park, nature preserve, they're using the pond and the small sphere, but they went ahead and did it anyway. They went ahead and put those toxic things there. So if you're attacking this, you got to attack it from a bigger picture. And I agree with your statement, but those of us who have lived here for a long time and fought some of the battles of worrying about the Huntington, harbor being polluted and raw sewage, and there was no controls. So Suffolk County Park Commission is quite a big organization, and they got a very rigid plan in place with budgets. That was my question, because you can't turn them off if they got money and they got funding. You got user groups who would support them. But there's also user groups like this group and other people who say, we'd like to see it naturally preserved, but maybe it's smaller. But we like to see Puppy Cove preserved. We like to see Huntington Harbor preserved. It's more attractive to people. You could have some of these other things. The boathouse could be fixed. You could fix the dock. But you have to put the rules, the user rules. Now, all user groups that are involved, if they're being told they're going to still be able to bring dogs, I don't know how dogs fit into a nature preserve. But if you say, you take the bigger picture, then you might have a better task at hand to stop them, because they're already down the road.
We're all sharing the same body of water.
Yeah, I know, and it's a beautiful scenic look. I lived here, and I used to take. You cannot beat the vision and the nature setting that's there, but it's already been, So anyway, that's my point.
Thank you so much. Well, you know what? Thank you, everybody, for giving their input. This is an election year, and your vote matters. So these are the things that are important to us. These are the things that we love. Suffolk County, the symbol for Suffolk County is a plow. And many of us who have lived in Suffolk County multiple generations, and that's not myself, have seen a lot of change. We can't stop change, we can't stop development, but we can influence thoughtful development. And the gentleman spoke about, and Barbara spoke about, the fact that fragmenting wildlife corridors impacts and degrades the quality of our lives. And once the environment degrades, it's gone forever. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for coming here and listening to us. These speakers were amazing. Another round of applause, if you would, for our speakers. This was actually the first time I got to hear David Joachim, and what a presentation. He has been so helpful to our group. So thanks to all the volunteers, the Unitarian Church, the technical crew. We also want to thank all our supporters here with us tonight and watching on Zoom. You've helped us by signing our petitions and making donations, spreading the word about the importance of protecting Coindre Hall wetlands. We are so grateful. If anyone is interested in our programs, the Monarch Butterfly, Nature Walk with David Joachim, or learning about native plants and invasive plant removal, you can find more information about that right here in our evening program. That's also right near where we showed you how to contact us, and how to also sign the petition through taking a picture of that QR code. We just want to thank you all for helping make this evening a success. It is the very first presentation this group has put on, and I want to thank all of our members because it was not easy. And we have been led by Desiree Ben, who has been incredible, and her husband, and all the people that contributed to this. Thank you so much, and we look forward to more programs in the future.